Ovulation predictor kits, or OPKs, can be a really great tool for finding your fertile days and helping you get pregnant. But here's the problem. There is a lot of misinformation and bad advice out there on how to use these tests. So it's very easy to misinterpret what they mean and get things wrong. And then, ironically, it can end up taking longer to get pregnant. So if you're finding your OPKs confusing and you want to get crystal clear on how to read them and use them the right way to boost your chances of getting pregnant, this video is for you. Hi, I'm Juliette Millar. I'm a trained natural fertility specialist with over 25 years experience. And welcome to Focus on Fertility, the YouTube channel dedicated to supporting you on your fertility journey with science-based tips and information you can trust to help you get pregnant as soon as possible. How do you know when your ovulation test is truly positive? And what does that actually mean? What's the difference between high fertility and peak fertility? When do you actually ovulate compared to a positive test? And most importantly, when should you be having sex if you want to get pregnant? These are just some of the questions I'll be answering in today's video. And the reason I wanted to spend some time on this is because, as I just mentioned, unfortunately there's a lot of bad advice and misinformation out there. What's worrying is that this bad advice could cause you to inadvertently miss some or even all of your most fertile days, and that can delay the time it takes to conceive. And what's surprising is that some of this misinformation actually comes from some of the companies themselves that make these tests, which seems bizarre, but maybe they don't want you to get pregnant quickly, so you keep buying more of these tests, maybe. So in this video, I'm going to clear up the confusion, break it all down, and walk you through how to read and use your OPKs the right way to get pregnant as soon as possible. And I'm going to share 6 science-based facts about ovulation tests that might surprise you. And if you'd like a handy reference that covers everything we'll discuss today and answers all your OPK questions, I've created a free downloadable guide called The Truth About OPKs, which I'll link to in the description below. Okay, let's dive in. Now, in this video, I'm going to assume that you already know what I mean by ovulation and your fertile window. But if you're new to all of this, or you'd just like a refresher, I do a deep dive on that topic and break it all down in another video called Best Days to Have Sex to Get Pregnant. So you might like to check that one out first. So I'll link to that up here and in the description below. Okay, to really understand what your ovulation test or OPK is telling you and how to read it correctly, you need to know a little bit about what happens with your hormones around ovulation. So, quick review. This graph shows the 4 key reproductive hormones: estrogen, progesterone, luteinizing hormone or LH, and follicle stimulating hormone or FSH, and how they change across one menstrual cycle. But for today, I just want you to focus on estrogen, or estradiol to be precise, that's the yellow line, and luteinizing hormone, the red line, because those are the 2 hormones that ovulation tests measure. You can see that during the first part of your cycle, which is known as your follicular phase, your estrogen or estradiol level increases and hits a peak just before ovulation. And that's because during the follicular phase, during that first part of your cycle, a follicle containing an egg is growing and developing inside your ovary. As that follicle grows, it secretes more and more estrogen. And once that level of estrogen is high enough for long enough, it triggers a surge of luteinizing hormone, or LH, from the pituitary gland in your brain. That surge of LH is called, no surprises, the LH surge, and you can see it here in red just before ovulation. And that LH surge is what triggers ovulation. Your egg is released from the ovary, it travels into the top of the fallopian tube, and if sperm are waiting, fertilization can happen. But here's the catch. The egg only lives for about 12 to 24 hours. If it's not fertilized in that short window, that's it, it's gone. You don't ovulate again, and there's no chance of pregnancy for the rest of that cycle. Thankfully though, unlike the egg, sperm can live for up to 5 days inside your body before ovulation, and that extends your fertile time. More on that in a second. So let's recap. High estrogen triggers the LH surge. The LH surge triggers ovulation. The egg is released from your ovary, and within 24 hours, the egg is dead and gone if it's not fertilized. So the next thing to understand is when you're actually fertile in this process. Your fertile window is an absolute maximum of 6 days long. The 5 days before ovulation, thanks to that sperm survival, plus the day of ovulation itself. And if you've watched that other video I mentioned earlier, you'll know that your most fertile days, the days where intercourse gives the highest chance of pregnancy, are usually the 2 to 3 days before ovulation day. Once you hit the day of ovulation, your fertility starts to drop. The day of ovulation itself is a less fertile day compared with those 2 to 3 days beforehand. So if you wait until the day of ovulation to start having intercourse, you'll probably have a lower chance of getting pregnant. And any intercourse after the day of ovulation has a 0 chance of pregnancy, no matter how hard you try. So if we go back to our graph, to maximize your chances of pregnancy, it's these days you want to aim for, the 2 to 3 days before ovulation day. Notice how these most fertile days are when your estrogen levels are rising sharply, and importantly, notice that the rise in estrogen starts before the LH surge begins, and that's a really important thing to keep in mind. So how do ovulation tests fit into all of this? Well, firstly, there are different types of ovulation tests, from simple paper test strips to more fancy ones in plastic holders, all the way up to digital options. Some of these tests just measure LH, and others measure both LH and estrogen. Personally, if you're going to use ovulation tests, I much prefer the ones that measure both, and the reason for that will become obvious in just a moment. Now, one important caveat. If you have PCOS, you may find that ovulation tests don't work for you. And that's because people with PCOS tend to have higher baseline levels of LH. So it's common to get repeat positive tests day after day, even when you're not actually ovulating, which can be really confusing and frustrating. So I typically don't recommend them if you have PCOS. Okay, let's start with the OPKs that test for LH only. The cheapest option is the little paper test strips, but you can also get them in plastic holders. Personally, I'm not a fan of the plastic ones because of all the disposable plastic, and functionally they do the same thing as the paper ones. Either way, they're designed to be peed on directly or dipped into a urine sample to measure your levels of luteinizing hormone. And what these tests are looking for is your LH surge. And if you think back to our hormone graph, your LH starts to surge just before ovulation. So a positive result is a warning that you're probably about to ovulate. Emphasis on the probably, which I'll get into shortly. The cheapest LH tests have a test line and a control line. The control line just shows you that the test is working properly. The test line is what gives you your result. It detects the LH in your urine and tells you if your LH surge has started or not. Important point, LH tests are different to pregnancy tests. They measure a different hormone and you have to read them differently. With pregnancy tests, if you see 2 lines, no matter how dark or light they are, you're pregnant. But with LH tests, if you see 2 lines, you have to compare the colour of the lines. Your body actually produces LH throughout your menstrual cycle, so if you see a faint test line, it just means you've got some LH in your urine. It doesn't mean you're ovulating. So what does a positive LH test actually look like? A positive result is when the test line is as dark or darker than the control line. That's it. No need to squint or tilt the strip under every light in the house or drive yourself crazy overthinking it. If the colour of the test line is as dark or darker than the control, or they're so close it's hard to tell the difference, that is a positive test. Even though it should be straightforward, interpreting the lines can actually be quite stressful. And that's why some apps offer to analyse the strips for you and give you a reading of low, high or peak. But, and I really want to stress this, I do not recommend these apps because they are very misleading and can actually cause you to miss your fertile days. More on that shortly. If you do find it difficult to interpret the lines, you might like to try a digital ovulation test instead because they figure it out for you. And they tell you if your test is positive or not with a smiley face or a little plus or minus sign or just the words yes or no. Ideally, you want one that tells you positive or negative, nothing in between. If a digital test gives you low, high or peak style readings, it falls into the same trap as those apps I just mentioned, and I don't recommend it. Okay, let's say you get a positive result on an LH test. What does it actually mean? It means two things. First, it tells you your LH surge has started. What it doesn't tell you is where you are in that surge, whether you're at the very beginning, in the middle, or right at the end of the surge. All you know for sure is that it's underway. Second, a positive test means you're likely to ovulate within the next 12 to 48 hours. But there is also a small chance you may have already just ovulated. And that's the bit I want to delve into because the information you're given on the OPK instruction sheets and on the websites of the companies that sell them can be misleading or just plain wrong. And if you're relying on that information to time intercourse, you could easily miss some or even all of your most fertile days. So I'm going to share 6 science-backed facts about ovulation tests that might surprise you and that you really need to know if you want to make the most of your OPK and use it the right way to boost your chances of getting pregnant. So, fact number 1, LH surges can vary, and the type of LH surge you have will affect the pattern of negatives and positives you see on your OPKs. We're often led to believe that an LH surge is a single short spike, like you saw on the graph earlier. But a really groundbreaking scientific study found that that's not the case, and the LH surge can actually be short, medium or long in length. It can also have a rapid onset, which means it reaches its peak quickly within a day or less, or it can have a gradual onset, which means it reaches its peak over 2 to 6 days. It can also have a single peak or a double or even multiple peaks or a plateau pattern. Now I know that sounds really confusing, but basically all it means is that you can't expect one standard pattern of positives and negatives on your LH tests. So don't worry if your pattern doesn't look like someone else's. We're all going to be different. And your pattern might change from one cycle to the next. So what might your pattern look like? If you have a gradual onset LH surge, you might notice your test line darkens gradually over several days before it finally turns positive. Or if you have a rapid onset surge, there might be no build-up at all, just an overnight switch from negative to positive. If you have a long LH surge, you're likely to see several days of positives in a row. Or if your LH surge is really short, you might miss your positive altogether. And if you have an LH surge with a double peak, you might get a positive, then 1 or 2 negatives, and then another positive, for example. The take-home message from this is that it doesn't actually matter what particular pattern you see. They're all considered normal variations. The most important thing is knowing when you actually ovulate and when you're most fertile. So, fact number 2, your peak LH level is not your peak fertility. This one drives me absolutely crazy. Please, no matter what you've read on the OPK instruction sheet or on the manufacturer's website, ignore this peak nonsense. This focus on the peak LH level is my biggest frustration with some of those ovulation apps I mentioned earlier. Peak LH is exactly what it sounds like. It's the highest level of LH during your surge, when your test line looks the darkest. But here's the truth. If you wait for that peak to start having intercourse, you could really hurt your pregnancy chances, and in some cases actually give yourself 0 chance of getting pregnant. And that's because by the time you reach your peak, there's actually a very good chance you've already ovulated, or you've got just a handful of hours left before you do. The science proving this has actually been around for a long time. One 2001 study that analysed 326 menstrual cycles found that more often than not, peak LH usually happens on or after ovulation day. And another more recent study confirmed this, showing that on average, peak LH occurs 1.2 days after ovulation day, and in some cases as late as 5 days after ovulation. And remember, ovulation day is the last day of your fertile window, and at this point your fertility is already dropping. And any intercourse after ovulation day has a 0 chance of pregnancy. Researchers stated more than 10 years ago that the timing of peak LH could be post-ovulatory, therefore should no longer be used to predict or determine ovulation. So why on earth are some apps still telling you that your peak LH equals your peak fertility? I honestly have no idea. It's just so misleading. What's most important is your first positive, not your peak. But even that isn't perfect. So let's get on to that now. Fact number 3, your first positive is the result that matters because that's the one that signals the start of your LH surge, usually before ovulation happens and when you're still fertile. Just to recap, your first positive is the first result when you're testing daily where the test line is at least as dark as the control line. It doesn't have to be darker. Or if you're using a digital test, it's when the smiley face goes from empty to smiley, or you get the yes text in the little window. And if you're using one of those apps I warned you about earlier, the ones that rate your LH as low, high, or peak, that first positive is often rated as high. Once you see that first positive, you can stop testing. You don't need to keep testing day after day to find your peak, because remember, that peak or that darkest line doesn't matter and you're just wasting money. So what does that first positive actually mean? It means your LH surge has started and you're probably going to ovulate within the next 12 to 48 hours. And I say probably because, frustratingly, it isn't 100% guaranteed. It is possible to get an LH surge and not actually ovulate. And it's also possible that you may have already just ovulated. Which brings me to fact number 4. The timing of ovulation after your first positive can vary. This is the tricky part. There's no way of knowing exactly when you'll ovulate after that first positive LH test. But what we do know from the research is that for most people, ovulation happens the day after that first positive, with one super helpful study finding that that's the case for about 76% of ovulations. But the study also found that almost 15% of ovulations occurred on the same day as the first positive. Just under 6% happened 2 days afterwards, and 3% of ovulations happened more than 2 days afterwards. And by the way, ignore the word peak on this table. They used a fertility monitor in this study which uses different definitions. And this fits with that other research I mentioned earlier, showing that ovulation can happen at the very beginning, during, or after your LH surge. And here's why it matters. It shows that it's not only possible to ovulate the same day as your first positive, but even before you see that first positive. Not common, but definitely possible. Because technically you could ovulate at the very beginning of your LH surge, during the night while you're still asleep, for example, then only see your first positive when you test later in the day, after ovulation has already happened. Or if you haven't yet ovulated, you may only have a handful of hours left before you do. And remember, your day of ovulation is the last day of your fertile window, and it's a day of lower fertility. So if you're waiting until you get a positive to start getting intimate, you could be cutting things a bit fine. That's why it's so important to start having intercourse for conception earlier, before you see your first positive. So onto that now. Fact number 5. Having intercourse before your first positive LH test is key for boosting your chances of pregnancy. I'm going to stress it again. The day of ovulation is the very last day of your fertile window, and your fertility is already starting to drop on this day. So because LH tests turn positive just before ovulation, they're actually picking up the end of your fertile window after some or even all of your most fertile days have passed. Remember, your most fertile days are usually the 2 to 3 days before ovulation day. So ideally, you want to start having intercourse for conception before you see that first positive LH test. That way, sperm can be waiting in the fallopian tubes ready to meet the egg as soon as it's released. Now, of course, that raises the question, how can you know in advance when those earlier fertile days are, leading up to ovulation? Well, that's where estrogen comes in. Remember from the graph earlier how estrogen rises dramatically in the days leading up to ovulation, and that sharp rise happens before the LH surge. Those high levels of estrogen correspond to the beginning of your fertile window, and we can use those high levels to get an earlier warning of ovulation. So, 3 things you can do. The first thing is to use an advanced OPK or a fertility monitor or device that measures estrogen as well as LH, because they detect that increase in estrogen about 4 or 5 days before ovulation, and they'll let you know you've entered your fertile window with a high fertility reading. The second thing you can do, if your cycles are pretty regular, is to record the days your OPK turns positive for a few months. You'll quickly spot the days of your cycle when you typically ovulate. Then in future cycles, you can just make sure you start having intercourse a few days beforehand. The third thing you can do, and this one is my favourite, is to monitor or track your cervical fluid. Fertile cervical fluid is a direct consequence of those high estrogen levels leading up to ovulation. So when you notice fertile cervical fluid, you'll know that you're in your fertile window, and ovulation will likely happen over the next few days. I cover cervical fluid in more detail in my other videos, but if you want to know the basics in the meantime, feel free to check out my Secrets of Baby Making Sex Fertility Guide, which I'll put a link to in the description below. Okay, we're just about there. That brings me to fact number 6. This last one is super quick, but really important. OPKs only tell you that you're probably about to ovulate. They can't confirm if it actually happened. Sometimes your body can gear up for ovulation, you can have all the signs, but then it doesn't actually go ahead. And this is more common in long cycles, and cycles with multiple LH peaks like we saw earlier, but it can happen in average length cycles too. That's why, personally, I prefer using OPKs together with basal body temperature tracking. Your basal body temperature, or BBT, rises after ovulation, giving you confirmation that you did actually ovulate and when you ovulated. Or alternatively, you can use test strips or a fertility device that measures PDG, or you can get a progesterone blood test done through your doctor. Those methods also confirm that you've ovulated. Okay, before we wrap up, let's recap. The pattern of negatives and positives you see on your OPK is due to the type of LH surge you have. The pattern isn't important, we're all different. What is important is recognizing your first positive, not your peak. And because some or all of your most fertile days may have passed by the time you get your first positive test, ideally you want to start having intercourse beforehand. And you can find those earlier fertile days with OPKs that also measure estrogen, or by keeping a record of when you typically ovulate, or by paying attention to your cervical fluid changes. Now, if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed and you're not sure how to put all of this into action, don't worry. I've distilled it all down for you into a simple 5-step protocol that works with the science, so you can confidently use OPKs to boost your chances of getting pregnant. And you can find that in the free fertility guide I mentioned earlier, which again I'll link to in the description below. Okay, well that's it for today's video. If you found it useful, please give it a big thumbs up, give it a like, and let me know in the comments what you found most helpful and how this information has helped your fertility journey. And of course, if you'd like to see more videos like this one, make sure to subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. Bye for now.